Welcome, everybody, to the January 15th, 2022 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. My name is Judy Flattery. I'm the president of the society. We have several of our board members here. I want to thank our board members for all the support that they provide us month in, month out, and all the board members who have served over the last 27 years of our existence. I want to introduce our speaker. I'm very excited to have Lon Ostrander as our speaker today. This is why I was interested in having him speak to us. Myself, and maybe many of us, have experienced leaving a religion, and we may have wrestled with issues such as when and if to tell our families, how do you fill the voids where religious community, rituals, and practices used to be. But now imagine if you're a religious professional, where that's your job, and you find yourself no longer believing in God or no longer believing in the dogma of your faith. Where do these people go for support? Who can they tell? Who do they feel safe talking to? How do they transition to a secular life? Well, Lon is the president of the Clergy Project, and the Clergy Project provides a safe and secure online community of forums composed entirely of religious leaders who no longer hold these supernatural beliefs. And I've asked Lon to come here today and tell us about the history of the Clergy Project, what's its mission, the diversity, the demographics of its participants, and any insights he's gained from reading all the applications. Participants have to submit applications to be accepted into this project, into this group. I'll also let him introduce himself, tell his own story and his vision for his organization, and testimonials from his participants. So with that, Lon, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Judy, and welcome to all of you. Glad to be able to share with you this evening. My name is Lon Ostrander, and I'm the current president of the Clergy Project. In 2007, when I first realized I was no longer a believer, the Clergy Project did not exist. Thus the subtitle to my talk tonight, because when you get in that position, you do immediately feel so alone. Strangely enough, a lot of the people close to you don't really want to talk about it. As a religious leader, you really can't come out and share it with your congregation. That's probably not going to fly. So you really have to be careful about what you say and who you say it to. You certainly can't be outspoken and celebrate your newfound liberty with just anyone that knows you and knows your history. It gets pretty awkward. But in the Clergy Project, we find that we are not alone. And that's probably our main product, just to provide a format so that people can come together and communicate with each other any number of ways. And we'll talk about that a little more later on. First of all, a little history lesson. You've probably all heard of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and Dan Barker. He was ordained to the ministry in the Standard Community Church in California. He served several congregations and several denominations for several years. In 1978, Annie Laurie Gaylor, along with her mom and Nicole Gaylor, launched the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And then 6 years later, in 1984, Dan came out to family and friends as an atheist. We don't recommend his method, by the way. He wrote a whole bunch of letters, 100 of them or so, and sent them to his coworkers and family members and lots of folks. And then he hung on for the repercussions. He did gain some notoriety rather quickly, and it was later in that year, 1984, that he appeared with Annie Laurie on a Chicago morning TV show hosted by someone you may have heard of by the name of Oprah Winfrey. Annie Laurie and Dan married 3 years later in 1987, and they both now serve as co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. In 2006, Dan Barker and Richard Dawkins met at a Humanist conference in Iceland. Richard Dawkins, as most of you likely know, is a British evolutionary biologist and author, perhaps best known for his criticism of creationism and intelligent design, and is the author of a book titled The God Delusion. So in Iceland, they discovered a shared desire to help non-believing religious leaders with similar circumstances to Dan's journey from preacher to humanist. It was a result of these conversations between Dan and Richard, along with a study done by philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett and qualitative researcher Linda Lascola, that the idea of an online support community for non-believing religious leaders was first conceived. 5 years later, in 2011, what then came to be known as the Clergy Project became a reality as a kind of a halfway house for current and former non-believing religious professionals. That was in March of 2011. And in November of 2011, I joined the Clergy Project. And I was about the 100th participant to join. I was very excited about that. Finally, I would have somebody to talk to and see what other folks were saying that were in similar circumstances. 2012, the Clergy Project was incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation under the leadership of Dan Barker. Terry Plank was our second president. I was elected in 2018 to complete the term of our third president, Drew Bakius, and in 2019 was elected to serve a full 3-year term. 2019, 2021, and last week I was elected to serve another 3-year term. So I don't know what I did to deserve this, but it's a privilege and we'll do our best. So a little bit about my story, just to fill you in. I was brought up in a Christian family. The first house I remember living in with my family was out in the country, and evidently my parents were invited to a small Pentecostal church just down the road, pastored by 2 young lady pastors. We attended the Pentecostal church till shortly after we moved to Elmira Heights in 1958. I would have been 8 years old. Well, I was very excited to get to town and have someone to talk to, too. Soon after arriving in Elmira Heights, we got an invitation to a GARB Baptist church. They had just built a brand new, shiny, big building, and so that seemed to be the place to go. So we immediately switched from being Pentecostals to being regular Baptists. Quite a change. I don't think I paid particular attention, but I'm sure I knew there were some differences. Number one, the sermons were probably a lot more boring. Baptist church through my teens and got married and divorced several years later and remarried to Susan, my present wife, and my last wife, I'm sure. And we've been married going on 44 years this December. So it was in 1994 that I was at a church conference, which is at a church camp in the summertime. I was just hanging out there on a nice summer day, and there was some sort of a business meeting going on that I'm sure I was not interested in at all. I'm sure I was daydreaming about something totally unrelated when, strangely enough, just like John Wesley, I felt this strange warming coming over my body from head to toe. And instantly, somehow, I was convinced that this meant that I was to prepare for the ministry. Went immediately to my pastor, told him the story. He took me to the chairman of the District Board of Ministerial Development, and he introduced me to some folks and told me about a course I could take that they had just developed through Indiana Wesleyan University for folks in my situation, middle-aged, a wife and 2 kids, and a full-time job and probably a couple part-time jobs. I dove in head first and enjoyed doing the courses and probably neglected my teenage boys considerably during that time. And then by 1995, I'd taken enough courses to be eligible to be licensed as a minister. And so, don't you know, I jumped at the chance. We took an appointment at a church in Griffin, Georgia, sold our house, quit my job, uprooted my wife and my boys, and off to Georgia we went, where I soon got in considerable trouble for talking to Black people. Evidently, I wasn't supposed to do that. Spent a year in Georgia, resigned at the appropriate time, partly because things weren't going great and partly because our oldest son had to go home to do his senior year in high school because the courses he'd taken in New York just didn't count in Georgia. He didn't want to start over again as a freshman. So we headed north. Took a church in Loganton, Pennsylvania, where I quickly got in trouble there for being a little too cordial with the Amish folks. That didn't go over well either. Anyways, a year there, and I ended up back up in Elmira and was an assistant pastor at a church in Elmira. Finished all my courses, excellent grades. According to the Wesleyan Church discipline, the district should have ordained me at the end of 7 years with everything completed, and they didn't. They should have notified the general superintendents of why they weren't ordaining me, but they didn't seem to think that was necessary. So they had me jumping through hoops for 3 more years. We went to our annual meeting and 10 years in, and it was obvious that they were not about to ordain me. Neither were they about to tell me why. So I looked at my wife and we got up and I said, I want you folks to know that I've always loved and respected you. And I still love you, meaning unspoken, and I don't respect you anymore. And we bailed out of there, and that was the end of that. But I was still a believer. I was not in a situation like so many folks in the Clergy Project of being caught as an unbeliever in the pulpit. So I was very fortunate. In fact, it was 6 years later when I finally decided that I no longer held any supernatural beliefs. I had been studying different denominations' theology and the Bible and trying to find a denomination that pretty much had it figured out, and none of them really did. But at this point, I thought, well, I'm going to make a list of things that I do believe about God and about Christianity, about the Bible, that I have good reason to believe. The obvious first point was that God actually exists, but I couldn't write that down. I realized that I didn't have any good reason to believe that either. And that was the end of that. I immediately decided to embrace the label of atheist and proceeded to live my life as an atheist, not giving any thought to prayer or God or religion, and sleeping in on Sunday mornings. That was a bit dismaying to my family, but I had no regrets, never looked back, and I tried to help them along as best as I could. My wife is still a believer. Some things we don't talk a whole lot about. That's enough about me. But as I said, I joined TCP in 2011. Really had no intention of getting involved. I just wanted to get my name on that roll, which would never be called up yonder. And I was no longer alone. We at the Clergy Project are not alone. Clergy Project's mission statement is to provide support, community, and hope for current and former religious leaders who no longer hold supernatural beliefs. As we all know, probably, communities grow out of a shared struggle. It's difficult to hold on to hope when you feel all alone. The good news is that hope is a natural product of the support and encouragement we find in a community of caring people on a similar journey. Support, community, and hope are what we do at the Clergy Project. We have an online forum where folks can post and reply to posts and take on about any subject they care to take on. And we also have a hidden Facebook group. In addition, we offer counseling through the Secular Therapy Project, as well as vocational transition counseling. But what we really do is solve that common problem of feeling all alone. I want to just share some insight from the applications. And Maureen, by the way, is the head of our screening committee. So folks hear about us, they find us on our public website, and there they can find their way to an application and fill it out and send it in. And the screening committee sees those, and Maureen assigns the applicants to screeners of a similar background. And so these are some things I gathered from the applications, a few applications. The first one was a Southern Baptist applicant, and he wrote, I threw myself into religion. When 14, I committed myself to full-time ministry. At 16, I was recruited to be the children's pastor intern. The position was created for me. I'm now 33. I've started a podcast for people leaving Christian fundamentalism. I don't know what else to do. I'm lost in my career life now and have no resources to go back to school. I'm working through the religious trauma. I'm realizing how unprepared I am for real life and how messed up my resume is. I'm currently unemployed. I have my son half-time, and I'm in credit card debt from trying to make ends meet after the divorce. marriages are often collateral damage of this kind of change in a religious leader's life. So why was this person applying to the Clergy Project? He wrote, "I hope to get some understanding of what I can do to thrive despite this overwhelming weight from my past. And if there are other resources I can tap into. I love doing my podcast and I feel it's important, but I can't make ends with that. I have graphic design experience, but I am not finding work with my education and background. Maybe I can network or find something that can help." Another person wrote that he had started ministry with the Church of Christ, and then the Presbyterian Church, and then a non-denominational house church. He wrote, "After obtaining a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Information Systems and spending 2 years in professional IT as an IT manager, I felt a call to ministry." There's some troublesome words right there. "I sold everything, home and possessions. My family, wife at the time and 2 children, sounds familiar, moved to another state. I entered ministry full-time, beginning as a full-time youth pastor and ended as a church planter in a house church movement. I was the radical kind. We preached on street corners. My family and I were to move to the mission field in South America in December of 2011. However, my doubts about Christianity and God became so severe that I merged our successful house church with a local Presbyterian partner church, pulled out of the mission team, and in January of 2012, stepped out of the ministry completely. Why am I applying? I've struggled to cope and find my place since leaving ministry. I'm now divorced with 4 children. I've been in and out of a few different jobs. I am in the greatest amount of debt I've ever been in. I feel completely lost and alone. I often get severely depressed about my situation and need community with which I can relate and find solace." Then we have a Muslim applicant. He writes, "I grew up with my father. He was an imam at the mosque in our village. I was taught some Arabic from childhood. I learned to recite the Quran by 8 years of age. By 16, I was an imam at the mosque, and I led mostly the noon prayers. I'm applying because I hope to get support now that I've been banished. I feel alone." Another wrote, "This journey has been painful, yes, but oh so lonely. That has been the worst." Again, that has been the worst. Not turning 180 degrees post-midlife, not discovering the majority of one's life has been spent following myths. What has been hardest is having no one to talk to about it, to be alone in a time and place when friendship would have mattered the most. Those are pretty typical stories of people who apply to the Clergy Project. Diversity in demographics. At this point, we have a total of 1,170 participants. Judy had asked, how likely is it that your participants remain in their clergy role for a year or more until they figure out what to do next? We really don't have stats on that, but it definitely happens. On the other hand, we have people that apply who are pretty close to retirement and they're fully prepared to stick it out another year or 2 years till they make retirement, then can go on their merry way and collect their pension and be relieved of all the stress that they're dealing with as religious leaders. Along that line, we also have people that have been retired for 10 or 20 years already, and they want to join the Clergy Project and have some folks to talk to. So it runs the gamut, as well as people who are pastoring and suddenly realize they don't believe any of it, and they may have investment in their schooling and maybe 20 or 30 years in pastoring, and retirement's still 20 years away. They know they can't survive that to the end. Currently serving, along with the same subject, it's about 25% of us. That is high. I have to hope that it's lower than that, and I have to believe that a lot of times people do transition into a secular vocation and just don't get around to sharing the good news with us. So whenever anybody does come on the forum or the closed Facebook group and shares that they've preached their last sermon and conducted their last service and they're out, I record that in our statistics. But I got to imagine half the people at least we never hear the good news from. So currently serving 25%, hopefully a lot less. Female participant, 14% of Clergy Project participants are females, which is probably a higher ratio than female participants in religious leadership as a whole. But as you know, the ladies are a little quicker than some of us guys, so I think they catch on quicker. To their credit, the ladies never wrote a word of the Bible either, so something's going on there. It's got to be good. Religious traditions represented. Well, we were founded in North America, so stands to reason most of us would be former Christians. That's about 96%. We represent more than 30 Christian denominations. About 2% of us are current or former rabbis. Also represented among us are former Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Native American tribal beliefs, Raelians, Wiccans, and Zoroastrians. I probably missed a couple. We have participants in 49 states and in Puerto Rico. We have no participants in North Dakota, but I don't think anybody really lives there. We have participants in 7 Canadian provinces and more than 50 countries around the world. You might be wondering about security concerns at TCP. As far as I know, I don't think we've ever had anybody hack in or get past screening who wasn't in agreement and who wanted to cause trouble. We've had from time to time have people kind of waver and they think they're atheists and then they want to go back and then they want to come back to us again. And they do that a couple times and we just refer them to recovering from religion. They're not ready to be with us. When we join the Clergy Project, we do assert that we no longer have supernatural beliefs. We are atheists or agnostics or whatever label you prefer, but we will have to make that clear in the screening process. So if you're still having a crisis of faith and wrestling with such things, we'll send you elsewhere, generally to recovering from religion. As far as security goes too, TCP is one place where our participants can feel free to be themselves. When they first join, it's understandable that they may have some discomfort about how secure our forum and closed Facebook groups are, but we encourage them to feel free to use pseudonyms and avatars. Their photograph doesn't have to be uploaded from the internet. That happens automatically. So if they don't want to reveal their identity in that way, we just use an avatar in their place. Sooner or later, most of us come out with our real names and our real photographs. So some would wonder maybe about the potential for our community to be fertile ground for launching non-theistic communities, congregations, etc. And while we don't do that as an official function of the Clergy Project, we certainly are supportive of such efforts at non-theistic community. In addition, many of our community are active in non-theistic groups like the North Texas Church of Free Thought, various Oasis groups, ethical societies, secular communities, and humanist societies. Judy asked, do your members generally feel a sense of relief when they finally conclude that they no longer believe? Or is it the beginning of a whole new chapter of anxiety and struggle? Yes to both of those, typically. We feel a great sense of relief and liberation and very happy to get that religion monkey off our backs. At the same time, there are going to be challenges coming down the pike. So yes to both. In general, it is very difficult and hazardous and unnecessary for religious leaders to disclose their New World view to their employers, their peers, their congregations, or their family and friends. Believers have little patience for minor theological differences, let alone all-out apostasy. So we recommend that you take it slow, come up with a plan, and be careful who you talk to and what you say. We recommend quiet and careful plan for transition to a secular vocation. When the time comes, a quiet exit is always best. We encourage our participants to leave behind the feelings of guilt so endemic to religion. We all have regrets about the years and resources invested in religious vocations, educations, but we focus on moving forward and making the most of our skills in the years before us. The topic clergy abuse, sexual and otherwise, comes up occasionally, but not that often, and usually in the context of some of our participants having been abused themselves, often by their superiors in their respective religious organization. Do most of your members make it through the process successfully? Again, hard to quantify. We don't have a process as such. We don't have a curriculum, but we just encourage communication. We certainly see a lot of positive feedback. Are there failures? Probably. Do we hear about them? Not so much. Are dealing with the impact of vows of celibacy and a significant issue? Probably would be for our Catholic brothers and sisters, but once they leave the faith behind, they definitely tend to not let that bother them, and they end up being married more often than not and having kids and having very happy and productive lives. Do you see any gender differences in the process of adjusting to secular life? Is it more difficult for men or for women? Is it more difficult for Catholics versus Protestants, Mormons versus Islam or others, old versus young? Any generalizations you observe? Well, of course, it's difficult for older folks to adjust to a new lifestyle. But other than that, we have observed that it's most difficult for people involved in the more fundamentalist denominations. They have the most trouble adjusting to the secular life. The depth of indoctrination and control in these groups makes leaving them very traumatic. So how can the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara members best support the Clergy Project? Well, I think the most important thing is to help us spread the word that we exist, to help current and former religious leaders who no longer hold supernatural beliefs. We often have people come to us who just recently heard that such an organization even exists. My vision for TCP would be that the existence of the Clergy Project would be common knowledge, that it would be the elephant in the room, in every room, every madrasa, every Sunday school, every Sabbath school, every pastor's study, every seminary classroom, every church board meeting. People need to know that if the religious vocation doesn't turn out to be what they'd hoped, and if their worldview changes drastically and they no longer believe what they're invested in promoting, the Clergy Project is there for them. Well, I got a few words of encouragement from Clergy Project Forum and the Facebook group. One wrote, "Welcome to the group. Very brave and a huge step to even join the Clergy Project and seek some advice." Another wrote, "Version 2 of your life begins. You deserve to enjoy it. I'm now 73 years old. My version 2.0 began 12 years ago, and life has never been more satisfying and fulfilling." Another wrote, "You have joined a world of people, individuals who together make a great life possible. You are one of us." And then a few comments I picked up from the TCP forum and hidden Facebook page. One participant wrote, "This was helpful. I pondered the 25 plus years I'd served in a fundamentalist Baptist church. What was all that? Whoosh, that was your life, mate. How to reconcile the years, the regrets. How does one deal with that?" Another wrote, "I am brand new to this group, and although I renounce all that I used to believe a few years ago, I have only recently begun to be more vocal about it and reach out to like-minded individuals." Another wrote, "I have finally cut religion fully out of my life, and I am so happy and overwhelmed by this new freedom that I don't even think I processed that I'm finally free after years of being miserable." Another wrote, "I can't express how good it feels to have folks to talk to who actually get it." Another wrote, "I was doing great before TCP just by virtue of being out of all the bullshit theistic nonsense. But joining TCP has enriched my life in so many ways and continues to do so." It's Maureen and my friend Mason Lane, also on the board. Another wrote, "Just to thank you and all the members of the Clergy Project, or the Irony Project, I have found more love, friendship, acceptance, support, dignity, and the list goes on among the participants of the Clergy Project and in its philosophy than I ever did in that institution that I left and that supposedly existed for just that purpose." That's a buddy of mine down in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Another wrote, I can't tell you how much the Clergy Project has helped me, especially knowing that I'm not alone. We are not alone. I'd like to mention that the Clergy Project is an entirely volunteer-run organization. I'd like to invite you all to visit our public website at theclergyproject.org and learn more about us, how you can donate to TCP, and if you are a non-believing current or former religious leader, how you can apply to join our merry band of apostates. Finally, the most important thing we can all do for the Clergy Project is just spread the word. We all likely know someone in religious leadership who no longer holds supernatural beliefs, who can benefit from community with our merry band of apostates. In 2007, when I, as a former pastor, first realized I was no longer a believer, the Clergy Project did not exist. Well, it does now. I joined in November of 2011, never intending to get involved, but here I am. It has been an adventure and a privilege, and I can assure you that we at the Clergy Project are not alone. Thank you to Judy Flattery and the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara for the invitation. Thank you for your time, and most of all, thank you for your interest in the Clergy Project.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lon. That was excellent. Very moving. And what an important job you're doing there. Could really feel very empathetic to the situation that the former clergy find themselves in, the non-believing clergy. Does anybody have a question for Lon?
Yeah, I just have a small question. Behind you on the wall, it's a picture of somebody.
That's a picture of our friend David Warnock, who was diagnosed with ALS several years ago and found that to be reason enough to go on a speaking tour called Dying Out Loud. You can Google him and catch his talks, and he's been all over the world talking and really helps some people going through some difficult times. He was at one time our secretary, I believe. We tried meeting on Saturday nights, and it seems that at the time David had quite a social life, and he still does, by the way. And that time wasn't working out for him. So we now have our board meetings at 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. And David is no longer on the board, but that time and date works just well for us because, you know, we're not in church. Yeah, that's Dave. Watching over my shoulder.
And Maureen, how did you become involved and get your role at the Clergy Project?
Yes, I come from a Catholic background. I was a nun for 18 years. I left. I rejected faith while I was still in the convent. I was in the nursing community. As I matured, I realized and thought about the idea. I couldn't reconcile the merciful, loving God with all the suffering that I was seeing, and gave myself permission to think about it and to read about how we got all our doctrines and brainwashing and where all these doctrines came from, which was ridiculous in 1700s as the councils decided that Christ was divine and all of those things that we believed. So I left the convent and married a man who was an Irish Catholic atheist, but I could never share my story with my family. I was kind of in the closet that way. My parents would have been disappointed. So my husband and I enjoyed our atheism, but I really didn't share it with many people. And then I met Dan Barker at a conference of FFRF in Hartford. He invited me. The Clergy Project was just beginning in 2010. He invited me to join. I joined in October of 2010. What I found there, it gave me a chance to pause and think about how I got into religion and how I got out of it. And I started writing, just did a lot of self-analysis, and it was a very affirming experience for me. Then after being on there for a long time, I became vice president. I get the applications and assign them to whomever. I will interview and do the screening on female applicants, and especially other ex-nuns. That's my story. It's been very affirming, and just to be able to share stories. And there's a bond with women who have been in the convent. There's a very unique bond, and so it's good to get together and to just kind of analyze what we believed and why we don't believe it anymore.
Thank you. I had started listening to a podcast about some nuns that were in Mother Teresa's orders, talking about what that was like. I don't remember the name of it offhand, but it was really fascinating.
An unquenchable thirst Johnson, I think her name is. She's a member of the Clergy Project also.
Oh,
She was a VIP actually in the order. She had very close association with Mother Teresa.
yeah, it was fascinating, the behind the scenes of it all, of the life in the order. Great. Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah, hi. Wonderful talk and wonderful work. The thought about the nuns brings to mind Karen Armstrong's wonderful memoir, The Spiral Staircase of Leaving, her long commitment to the cloister and really ultimately becoming an atheist, but it's a long journey, awfully well written. My own background is like Dan Barker's. I went to Azusa Pacific. I went to a Baptist seminary, but I flew over the wall in the 70s, long before this kind of support was around. And I'm so glad it now exists. Because I'll tell you, the worst part was the loneliness. My whole circle of friends was evangelical Pentecostal, and they just kept witnessing to me. It was such a pain in the ass. They, endlessly, and of course they meant well. They thought I was going to lose my chance at heaven when I was just really glad to be losing it, glad to be out, and the cloud of guilt. My question is about backsliders in your group. Do you find people going off and getting interested in something else supernatural, Eastern teachings or New Thought teachings or something? Do you find that a certain percentage of those who have escaped from the rigid thinking, finding what really is sort of another form?
Like woo or something even.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a lot. It does happen. I'm thinking 1/10 of 1% maybe.
Mm.
As far as backsliding toward belief in the supernatural, very, very few, as I'm saying. But there are some who are still looking for some kind of a community. They miss the togetherness. Some go to the UU church, or I think there's almost like a transition period. After a while, that wears thin also, and then they don't need that togetherness anymore.
Any other questions?
Yes, I've got some questions. I have made quite a few changes in my outlook. They haven't been away from religion because I was born of an atheist mother, but I have made changes in other directions. And I found while I was doing that my intellect was out of touch with the rest of my brain, and my brain was working this problem without my actually being aware of it. And I wonder if you ever had that experience.
I don't think I thought of it quite that way, although that's a perfectly good way to look at it. I think we certainly have the ability to compartmentalize and be logical, rational human beings on one hand, but on the other hand, we can buy into the religious woo and convince ourselves that we really ought to believe that too. And yes, you can have that discussion with yourself about theology and religion and have those talks and arguments inside your own head. Yeah, eventually it surfaces. It catches up with us.
Thanks. Bonnie?
I was thinking about when I was a child and was required to go to Sunday school and sitting in class and going, do these people really believe this stuff? So that's kind of my question. Is there any knowledge of how many people go into the pastoring without really believing it, but it's a job? So is there any studies? Is there any knowledge about that?
I wouldn't have any knowledge about that. I can't imagine somebody going into studying for a religious vocation and not really believing it, although it's possible they're maybe on the edge of belief and really want to believe because they really want to believe in the efficacy of belief. But certainly there are cases when they're ministerial students and doing the studies that the doubts arise. And of course, in any case, when we're in religion, we think, well, that's because, God's ways are so far above ours. And eventually we'll figure this out, or somebody smarter than we are will explain it to us. Hopefully our professors, right? But they probably have more questions than we do rather than answers. And that's probably why they're professors and not the pastors. Just a theory. But along with that, just an anecdote that's interesting with my own siblings. We were attending the Pentecostal church upon invitation. And so that would have been when we were very young. And I have two sisters. The older of the two younger sisters never really bought into the religion thing at all. And she thought that we were only going to this church and hanging around with these crazy people because we liked Sunday school picnics and the social aspect of it. And when she realized that we really believed this stuff, she thought we were all crazy. And she would have been about 6 years old at the time.
Mm.
I would say that of the over 1,000 participants we have, I've never heard anybody say that they went in for any other reason than they felt that they were called to be religious and save souls and spread the word
Mhm.
of Christ. And when they no longer believed or when they were doubting, were tortured and praying and doing all kinds of penance and that, begging God, groveling to please restore their faith. I haven't heard anybody that went in for other reasons.
We have a recent case where one of our folks that is working with the vocational transition, a young fella who's no longer believes and is out of ministry, but he was a pastor. And our guy is helping him get his GED because, education wasn't all that important in his denomination. He was probably ordained as a pastor, he's probably ordained when he was 14 or 15 years old.
Well,
Yeah.
that leads into Wayne's question, or Diane saying, is there any secular work that former religious leaders tend to gravitate to?
Several instances of clinical psychology, social workers. Some were computer nerds while they were in the church. And so they segue right into that. Some become teachers. So there are similarities. Certainly, some probably go back to what they wanted to do before they were convinced that God was calling them into religious work.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that you had this warm feeling come over you.
Yeah,
How do you interpret that now?
temporary insanity. And it hung on for a long time. No other explanation. I mean, it wasn't being beaten into my head. My pastor wasn't preaching about young people going into the ministry. That wasn't the topic. It was not on my mind. There's no explanation for it, but it happened, and I was not to be persuaded otherwise. Well, of course, in my group, nobody tried to persuade me otherwise. My wife thought it was great, and obviously the pastor thought it was great. That church people just encourage you in that direction. Nobody's going to try and reason with you at that point. So
I think I'd just like to comment on the person who saw Dave Warnock's photo behind Lon. And as Lon said, he was diagnosed with ALS, and he now has a mission to preach about his getting ready to die, but dying out loud without believing in God. His story, he was a pastor. His wife and daughters are members of a very, very fundamentalist, strict congregation. When he lost his faith and left, his daughters were convinced by their pastor they could have nothing to do with their dad. And he was not able to see them. They were adults. He was not able to see their children at all. His wife, although she wanted to live with him, the pastor and the daughters told her that as long as she continued to be with her husband, their dad, that she would also be ostracized. They would not see her, nor could she see her grandchildren. They had to divorce. Think of the torture that he went through in losing his faith.
Yeah, it's a lot of loss there. Any other questions?
This is Jules Bender. Can you speak a little more about dying out loud?
not effectively, probably. Maybe Maureen can handle that better than I can, but I did see David speak once, and he talks about death and the trauma to the family and coping with losing loved ones. And it's a very moving experience. When I saw him in Philadelphia, I think maybe a couple years now, he seems to be losing a lot of the strength in his arms. I remember I was outside with him, and he had his cell phone with him, and he was trying to give directions to a lady friend to meet us there on the street. And then he asked me, he said, "Lon, can you hold on to my cell phone? It's getting too heavy." He still walks and he still drives, but the upper body strength is really gone.
If you
Yeah, Maureen.
Google Dying Out Loud, Dave Warnock, Warnock, you could hear some of his podcasts there. There's probably some YouTube there also. And his new book is coming out, Leaving Childish Things, I think. He just wrote his memoir. It's out this month. Leaving Childish Things, I believe is the name of it.
Great, we'll look for that. Any other questions?
This is not facetious. I'm just curious because you were a pastor. And if you were speaking to a congregation of atheists and agnostics, what would you be telling them?
As a believing pastor?
No, as an atheist.
Oh, as an atheist, what would I be telling them? Probably pretty much like Dave would tell them to seize the day, or he says carpe the fucking diem. Yeah, don't leave the guilt trips behind, and don't miss an opportunity to do something that's really going to make your life better and happier. So when I have a quandary, I generally do stop a minute and think, what would Dave do? And then I recall, carpe the fucking diem, dummy. So
Do you have another day job in addition to the Clergy Project?
yeah. I'm strictly a volunteer with the Clergy Project, but I work in industry. I'm a quality assurance specialist, and I work for a consulting company, and we go to builders that are building streetcars, subway cars, buses, and we represent the client that's buying the thing. So we're on-site spies, and we represent the client, and we make sure that things are done correctly, and we know everything and take all the money. It's a good gig, and I'm assigned now only 200 miles from home, so I can come home every weekend. But I spent a year in Mexico, and they flew me home twice a month from Mexico. Yeah, spent a summer in Japan, and I worked in Idaho and California and Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia and every place but my hometown because they know me here. So that's about it.
Wonderful. Anything else? Or we want to end on carpe the fucking diem. I like that.
When I went to see Dave, he was speaking in a Unitarian Universalist church facility, and he said "fuck" from the stage, and I thought, man, that was so great. And then he did it again, and I just was so liberating. So we former religious leaders just love to use colorful language now because there was taboo.
Do you
so
tend to swear more than the average person?
We really, not Maureen, of course, but everybody else. But we really enjoy being quite unruly. Yeah.
You have to catch up. I mean, you lost some time there. Yeah. Being good. Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you. This was fantastic. Thank you, Lon and Maureen, both for joining us and sharing your story with us. I encourage all of us to check out the Clergy Project, see what you can do to support it. If you know clergy, let them know. Let them know this exists. Let's do what we can to support them. Donate if you choose to.
Judy, can I have one more question?
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I couldn't come up with the name of the organization. It's my advanced age, but I just did. Scientologists. Are there any Scientologists in your group? Lon?
I'm going to say yes. I think there are one or two.
I know that Scientology has had a lot of growth in Australia.
Could well be.
Yeah. Questions before I go on to other announcements? This is MLK weekend. So here are two of my favorite quotes of MLK. People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. And then the second one is the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. So happy Martin Luther King Day to everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I appreciate your participation in the Humanist Society, and we'll see you a week from tomorrow for those of you interested in the COVID talk.